Hey everybody, Lori Spencer here. Hope you're having a safe and happy holiday. It's been a while since I uploaded any new content to my channel. Hopefully, you've been catching up on previous episodes during my brief hiatus, and I also hope that you enjoyed my 12-part true crime series, Who Killed Bobby Kennedy, that I devoted a big chunk of 2024 to writing, researching, and producing. If you haven't checked those out yet, you can find them under the Podcasts tab of my channel. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and on Rumble too for the uncensored videos that YouTube won't let me show you at rumble.com/Lori Spencer. As 2024 draws to a close and I'm getting a little more free time over the holidays to catch up on my reading, I thought it might be cool to share the books I really enjoy with you. If you follow my other YouTube channel at Kennedy Americans, you know that I'm a Kennedy buff, and I've chronicled this fascinating American political dynasty's rise from the patriarch Joseph P. Kennedy to the presidency of John F. Kennedy to the assassinations of JFK and RFK, right up to now and the presidential campaign in 2024 of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. with the Kennedy Americans podcast, which you can listen to on my Rumble channel at rumble.com/Kennedy Americans. Now that Donald Trump has appointed RFK Jr. to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services in his upcoming administration, the American people's interest in the Kennedys is rekindled, and a new generation of Americans are curious to learn more about RFK Jr., the Kennedy family's lasting imprint on our American life, culture, and politics. So this seems like the perfect time to pull some of my favorite books about the Kennedys down from the bookshelf, blow the dust off, and share them with you, along with my own commentary and knowledge gathered over 40 years doing research on the Kennedy family. This week, RFK Jr. will be on Capitol Hill, visiting with senators, hoping to convince them to confirm him to this important cabinet-level job. And since HHS is a vast agency that has a lot to say over the lives of every American citizen, the Senate's advise and consent role in the confirmation process is vital to ensuring that Kennedy is not only qualified, but is the best man for the job. Is he the best man for the job? It's certainly a controversial pick, one that is likely to face a lot of scrutiny from lawmakers during his confirmation hearings. Bobby Kennedy's checkered past and personal life raise many questions. Aside from his policy positions, a virtual Pandora's box that will surely be opened by senators, by FBI background check investigators, and of course, by the press over the weeks ahead. If you just discovered RFK Jr. recently, you might not know much about him. You no doubt know about his stance on vaccines and of his failed presidential run in 2024, his last-minute endorsement of Donald Trump, and his Make America Healthy Again movement. But there's much more you probably aren't aware of unless you've known about him for decades or followed his work for a great length of time like I have. As a Kennedy family historian, it is a bit frustrating that there aren't many books available about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Only 2 biographies have been published. An authorized biography written by Kennedy's friend, Dick Russell, that was released last year to coincide with his run for the presidency. That book, The Real RFK Jr., is about what you'd expect from a chosen acolyte. It's a whitewash that omits any facts that might be inconvenient to the candidate's desired narrative or detrimental to the image of himself as a moral crusader fighting for truth, justice, and the American way. The other book, an unauthorized biography, paints a more balanced picture of Mr. Kennedy, and it's not always a pretty one. That's the book we will be reading together and discussing in this History Book Club series because it's just far more interesting. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream was published in 2015 by St. Martin's Press. written by Jerry Oppenheimer, who also penned a scathing biography of Bobby's mother, the late Ethel Kennedy, titled The Other Mrs. Kennedy. So it seems only natural that Oppenheimer would pen a book about RFK and Ethel's most famous and most controversial offspring. The New York Daily News called it a bombshell, unauthorized biography which tells the haunting past that kept Kennedy from following in his father's footsteps. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. inherited his assassinated father's piercing blue eyes and Brahmin style, earning a reputation as the nation's foremost environmental activist and lawyer. The Toxic Avenger, they called him, battling corporate polluters. But in this, the most revelatory book ever written, I think, about a Kennedy, Jerry Oppenheimer places Bobby Jr., leader of the third generation of America's royal family, under a journalistic microscope, exploring his compulsions and addictions, from his use of drugs to his philandering that he himself blamed on what he called his lust demons, and tells the shocking behind-the-scenes story of the curious events leading to the tragic May 2012 suicide of Mary Richardson Kennedy, his second of his 3 wives, mother of 4 of his 6 children. If his late cousin, JFK Jr., was once called Prince Charming, RFK Jr. might have earned the nickname the Big Bad Wolf. This book is based on scores of exclusive, candid, on-the-record interviews, public and private records, correspondence, and a whole lot more. The author, Jerry Oppenheimer, paints, I think, a very balanced, objective, and often shocking portrait of RFK Jr. Like his slain father, the iconic senator and presidential hopeful, RFK Jr. seemed to be destined for political greatness, or so it seemed to many of us at one time or another. Why it never happened is finally revealed in this unflinching biography of him. Whether you're a big fan of RFK Jr. or not, there is much you can learn about him from Oppenheimer's book, and that's why I'm sharing it with you now, as Kennedy seeks to run one of the largest and most important agencies of the federal government in a second Trump administration. Because those who hold great power and those who seek it should be carefully scrutinized with a curious, open mind and watched with a cautious and distrustful eye. A little bit about the author. Jerry Oppenheimer is the New York Times best-selling author of Crazy Rich: Power, Scandal, and Tragedy Inside the Johnson & Johnson Dynasty, as well as unauthorized biographies of Hillary and Bill Clinton, Rock Hudson, Martha Stewart, Barbara Walters, Ethel Kennedy, Jerry Seinfeld, and the Hilton family. He's worked as an investigative reporter and producer of television news programs and documentaries. He writes with a fast-paced, no-nonsense style that will keep you riveted from page 1 all the way through page 360. So, without further ado, let's dive in and explore the dark side of Robert Kennedy. It's darker, much darker than you probably know. Some of this might be uncomfortable for some of Kennedy's fans to hear, but that's all the more reason why you should listen. Before we begin, just a quick disclaimer from our legal department. This book club reading falls under the Fair Use Provisions, Section 107 of the United States Copyright Act. It is intended strictly for nonprofit educational purposes such as criticism, commentary, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research purposes, as well as making this book accessible to persons with a reading disability, for the blind, and for people who are learning the English language. I encourage you to purchase a copy of this book from your favorite bookseller and follow along in the text with this recording as we go. During the reading, I will pause from time to time to provide analysis, critique, and commentary on the book, add my own insights as a journalist and historian, point out errors that the author or book editors didn't catch in the editing process, make some corrections on factual inaccuracies, and answer viewer questions. You're welcome to ask any questions you might have about the book in the comments section or the live chat, and I'll do my best to answer all of them in the next video. This book club is an interactive experience, so I want to hear your thoughts as well. And now, let's begin our journey. Prologue. This is the story of the scion of one of the most famous, most powerful, most privileged contemporary political dynasties the free world has ever known. An heir to an immense fortune who had every advantage, yet was plagued, as will be documented, by horrific addictions and paralyzing insecurities. Still, he was considered the undisputed leader of the third generation of Kennedys, and one of the most polarizing. Once believed to be the standard-bearer, the future hope of the dynasty, Bobby Kennedy Jr. was seriously considered to be the clan's second coming, the next Kennedy to command the Oval Office. In the beginning, the Kennedys had high hopes for Bobby, that he would be their new symbol after the assassinations of his father and uncle, that he would invigorate the Camelot myth, that he would be the so-called royal family's shining representative. It never happened. As his story shows, he became the end rather than the fulfillment of the dream. While he had teased the media through the years about throwing his hat into the political arena like his father and uncles before him, a public service career was practically guaranteed of RFK's namesake. He always feared that the skeletons in his closet, and there were many, would be unleashed. Instead, he would curiously fall back on family values and fathering his 6 children from what would be 2 of 3 marriages as his reasons for not running for political office. Instead, he made a name for himself in the less controversial but increasingly popular and sometimes glamorous environmental movement. He had been named one of Time magazine's Heroes for the Planet, heralded as one of Rolling Stone's 100 Agents of Change, dubbed by People magazine America's Toxin Avenger, and called a self-made nemesis of big-time polluters, carrying on his father's tradition of crusading against the powerful. He was a professor of governmental law at Pace University School of Law, the co-director of the school's Environmental Litigation Clinic, president of Waterkeeper Alliance, and a senior attorney for the National Resources Defense Council. Unlike the other iconic Kennedy namesake, his far more handsome first cousin and pop culture icon, John F. Kennedy Jr., John to an older generation, Bobby was far more complex, driven and reckless, a monument to scandal, controversy, and excess, a life that paralleled the decline in the power, prestige, and politics of America's royal family. As the Time columnist Margaret Carlson cogently once observed, when you look at the third generation of Kennedy men, much of what remains of a once powerful dynasty is good teeth, good hair, and the best public relations a trust fund can buy. All that Bobby and his cousin John shared was the Kennedy blood and the tragic assassinations of their fathers. While John, after his father's death, was brought up by a controlling and domineering mother, but one who obsessively looked out for his care and well-being, Bobby, after his father's death, was essentially given up by his angry, widowed mother. With his father gone, Bobby's Uncle Ted was thought to be the acting patriarch, but he had his own serious personal problems with which to contend. As a result, Bobby's sole male role model during his troubled adolescence through his even more unsettled young adulthood was a closeted and ill-at-ease homosexual, a decades-long Kennedy family acolyte by the name of Kirk Lemoyne, also known as Lem, Billings, who had transferred his obsessive, intimate love from the late president, beginning when they were at boarding school together, to Bobby himself. The first time the gay bachelor spent time with young Bobby, he came away enthusiastically declaring, "I've just met the smartest little boy. He's just like Jack." Later, he would use drugs with Bobby, while at the same time convincing him that he could be president one day. As another of Bobby's first cousins, Christopher Kennedy Lawford, who early on idolized Bobby and who, like Bobby, was long addicted to drugs, candidly observed, "The loss of Robert Kennedy was the loss of one of the most consequential figures of that time. Bobby Jr. existentially got an enormous amount of star power carrying just those initials. He also got a lot of magnetism from Lem's fixation with him. Lem had decided that Bobby was the next bearer of Kennedy greatness, and none of us were about to argue." President Kennedy, Bobby's uncle, considered biography his favorite literary form. The reason? It attempted to answer the question, what was he really like? In an effort to answer that question, this, then, is Robert Francis Kennedy Jr.'s story. Chapter 1. Parochial Schooling. Ethel Skakel Kennedy gave birth to her husband's namesake, Bobby Jr., on January 17, 1954, at Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. He was the third of her and Robert Francis Kennedy's children, coming after Kathleen and Joe II in what would one day be a brood of 11. As it happened, Bobby came into the world at an ironic moment in the Kennedy clan's chronology, just a few days after the Hollywood sexpot Marilyn Monroe married her second husband, the Yankee slugger Joe DiMaggio. In the Kennedy family drama, Marilyn would famously play a starring role as the reputed mistress of both Bobby's father and Bobby's uncle, the president, during the era known as Camelot. 8 more siblings would follow on Bobby Jr.'s heels as his young, athletic, and zealously Catholic 26-year-old mother was determined to have a bigger family than that of her revered mother-in-law, the Kennedy family matriarch, Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, who had given birth to only 9. But young Bobby was the special one of Ethel's children, for he was named after the idolized United States Senator from New York, the assassinated presidential hopeful who, during JFK's ill-fated administration, had served as his brother's Attorney General of the United States, the nation's highest law enforcement officer. RFK, at 29, had been out of work during a portion of the time Ethel was carrying Bobby. He had quit the job his father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, one-time reputed Prohibition-era bootlegger, ex-Hollywood mogul, Wall Street speculator, former U.S. ambassador to Great Britain under FDR, and notorious philanderer, had secured for him through his friend, Joseph McCarthy. An Irish Catholic, an alcoholic, considered evil incarnate by many, the Republican senator from Wisconsin was chairman of the powerful Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations of the Senate Government Operations Committee, better known as the McCarthy Committee. RFK had a law degree from the University of Virginia in Charlottesville and a diploma from Harvard when he was hired as an assistant to the McCarthy Committee's general counsel. He shared his father's and McCarthy's determination to search out and destroy suspected communists in the U.S. Army, in federal government agencies, and just about anywhere else, many of whom were innocent and whose lives were ruined. He also went along with a parallel McCarthy persecution of homosexuals in government that became known as the Lavender Scare. Fortunately, RFK, an heir to the fortune his father had made, and his wife, Ethel, an heiress in her own right, didn't have to support their fast-growing family on his paycheck. His starting salary was $95.24 a week. He received a couple of raises along the way, eventually earning $7,000 annually. But after just 7 months, he quit his job. He blamed his decision on McCarthy's right-hand man, Roy Marcus Cohn, who was 2 years younger than RFK, but had earned a national reputation as the tough prosecutor who had controversially helped send the convicted Soviet spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg to the electric chair. RFK despised Roy Cohn because it was Cohn's job that RFK had once coveted but didn't get. Moreover, he intensely disliked him because of his sexual preference. Cohn was a closeted homosexual, and RFK had a thing about those kinds of people. Looking to his father again for another job, the patriarch secured his third son, born after Jack and before Ted, a position as an assistant on what was known as the Hoover Commission, then headed by former President Herbert Hoover, who had just turned 80. Ambitious, restless for action, and hungry for power, RFK found the job, which had to do with the stuffy reorganization of the executive branch, tedious and boring, and he began feeling depressed. But the birth of Bobby Jr., his namesake, lifted him out of the doldrums. Once again, after his father made a call on his behalf, RFK was named counsel for the Democratic minority of Joe McCarthy's subcommittee. The appointment came just in time for the beginning of the infamous, history-making, nationally televised Army McCarthy hearings that began 4 months after Bobby Jr.'s birth, at the height of the nation's Red Scare and at a dark moment in the Cold War. Animals and birds seemingly were always part of Bobby's life, even, he once claimed, when he was still in a crib. His mother had told him that when he was a baby, he was fascinated with the bugs he saw crawling around in the garden of the Kennedy estate, Hickory Hill in McLean, Virginia, where the family had moved when he was only 3 months old. The spectacular mansion had once belonged to Bobby's Uncle Jack and his Aunt Jackie, and had been a gift to both couples by the Kennedy patriarch. At 9, Bobby had a veritable menagerie at the family's fabled Northern Virginia homestead, which included a variety of small pests, the scourge of most homeowners, ranging from raccoons to rats to snakes. He claimed he once bought a couple thousand ear-shattering crickets to feed to his lizards. He also had his own mini poultry farm, in addition to a horse, a calf, and a variety of other animals. The 2008 thriller Snakes on a Plane could have been based on an experience Bobby had as a kid when he took a sack of his pet reptiles aboard a flight from Washington National to LaGuardia in New York, and all of the slithery, scary things accidentally got loose in mid-flight. As female passengers screamed and may have jumped up onto their seats, Bobby crawled around and gathered them all up. One of the stories he likes to tell about his childhood was about a visit he made to the Oval Office when his father was Attorney General of the United States, and young Bobby presented his Uncle Jack, the president, with a small spotted salamander that he had recently caught on Hickory Hill's almost 6 acres. His mother had dressed him in short pants for the visit, and Bobby always kept a photograph of himself seated near Uncle Jack as the president gently poked the 7-inch amphibian with one of those presidential pens he used to sign bills into law. Uncle and nephew then gave it a new home in the White House fountain. There were those other visits to the weekend White House at Camp David in Maryland. While his father and uncle held private meetings at the Presidential Lodge, Bobby, with Secret Service agents close by, tried to scope out the fierce wolverines that inhabited the surrounding woods. At 11, Bobby decided to become a falconer when his father, soon to be elected to the United States Senate from New York, his stepping stone, he believed, to a second Kennedy presidency, gave him a red-tailed hawk, which Bobby named Morgan Le Fay after the sorceress in the King Arthur legend, which he had read about in T.H. White's book, The Once and Future King. Through the years, Bobby's stories often conflicted, or were contradictory, or were outright inventions about something as mundane as who had interested and trained him in falconry. In his co-authored 1997 book, The River Keepers, about how he and a colleague battled Hudson River polluters, he said an engineer at the Pentagon had taught him the sport, which involved training falcons, which are birds of prey, to hunt for quarry. Later, however, in a blog at petplace.com, an online source of pet information, headlined Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the Bird Rehabilitator, he was quoted as saying that an obscure Arab friend of his father's, one Alva May Nye, supposedly a State Department operative, had piqued his interest in falconry. An abuser of drugs for at least some 15 years of his life, and a reputed sex addict for many more, according to his own diary entries and other accounts, Bobby once noted that the central tenet of his mother's life was her devotion to Catholicism, and that his father's devotion had even rivaled hers, and that all of it had carried over to him. In his book, The River Keepers, coincidentally published the same year his brother Michael was embroiled in a sex scandal involving his family's teenage babysitter, and his congressman brother Joe's wife wrote a tell-all critical of him, seeking an annulment because he wanted a Catholic church wedding with his secretary girlfriend. Bobby waxed nostalgic about how religion was a major part of his family's home life when he was growing up. For instance, he noted that his rosary-carrying mother always led the family in prayer as they knelt, and that the family attended daily mass with her on holidays and in the summer. He recalled that they had fainted from hunger during high mass, that Sundays were a day of fasting, that prayers were said before and after meals, that on Fridays fish was served, and they read about and prayed with particular fervor to various saints. His parents, he stated, frequently quoted St. Paul's mantra, "To whom much is given, much is expected," and he said he and his siblings strived to give them our best. Bobby noted that he and his brothers and sisters had received parochial school educations, but that wasn't always the case. His first school, with just 8 classrooms, was on the fringe of Georgetown, Our Lady of Victory, founded by a Father Yingling. As it turned out, Bobby's matriculation there suddenly caused a problem for his Uncle Jack's administration when it was revealed that Our Lady of Victory was all white at a time when the Kennedy administration was advocating school integration and the nation's first civil rights bill would soon be passed. For Republicans, and especially Southern Democratic politicians, the revelation by the school's Mother Superior that, quote, "we have no Negroes here," apparently there are no Negroes in our parish, sparked a furor, the Benghazi of its time for the Democrats of Camelot, and put the Kennedys on the spot. RFK wanted to immediately have Bobby transferred to the non-sectarian Landon School in Bethesda, Maryland, but Ethel fought against the move, desiring that the namesake get a full Catholic education, just as she had gotten. Ethel Skakel had inherited her religious fervor from her mother, the former Anne Brannock, a simple office worker from a blue-collar Irish Catholic South Side Chicago family who had struck it rich when she wed Ethel's father, George Skakel, a shrewd businessman who wasn't Catholic and who couldn't countenance his wife's fanatical adherence. Rather than fight it, though, he had looked the other way when she raised Ethel and her siblings in her own religious image. As a Catholic childhood friend recalled, if we missed a day of church, it wasn't a sin, but for Ethel it was. She was very devoutly religious, extremely so. She used to tell me she'd only marry a Catholic. Nevertheless, the political heat on the Kennedy administration far outweighed her desire for young Bobby to have a Catholic and presumably all-white education. To end the embarrassing scandal, the fifth grader was quietly transferred from the all-white Our Lady of Victory to the exclusive but integrated Sidwell Friends of the Quaker persuasion, whose political alumni over the years included Nancy Reagan, Julie Nixon, and Chelsea Clinton. The transfer, however, did not go over well with Our Lady of Victory's principal. She asserted that racism was not the issue and claimed that Bobby and his sixth-grade brother Joe often missed school with the excuse that they had colds, and that the transfer to Sidwell was because the private fancy school had a tutoring program for kids like the Kennedy brothers who got poor grades and had repeated absences. Bobby completed elementary school, sixth grade at Sidwell, temporarily leaving behind his mother's desired Catholic education for him. As he wrote in The River Keepers, his parents had, quote, supplemented our parochial school instruction in the Catholic creed by emphasizing the life of saints, and particularly the joys of martyrdom, secular or religious. As he prepared to begin his junior high school years, a world of change was happening for young Bobby. His mother had become pregnant with her ninth, which would tie the record set by the Kennedy matriarch, Rose. Despite Kennedy's spin to the contrary, the kids' parents rarely were around, leaving their 8 children behind with nannies and other volunteer help. Ethel and RFK, always obsessed with his political future, traveled to West Berlin, Greece, and Rome, where they met with Pope Paul, and everywhere spread the Kennedy gospel. At 38, RFK, already looking ahead to a presidential run, announced at the end of August 1964 that he had decided to seek election to the U.S. Senate from New York. During the campaign, Bobby's spirited mother would be on the road day and night, tirelessly campaigning for her son, shaking as many as 800 hands at one of her highly publicized, exuberant campaign coffee clatches. Women of all political persuasions came out in droves just to be in the presence of a Kennedy wife. With RFK running, the Camelot myth was alive and well. The candidate and his wife used cute and lively young Bobby and his photogenic siblings, too, wherever they could to promote RFK's election. For instance, during the shooting of a campaign commercial directed by the famous agent and producer Leland Hayward, Ethel had gathered together her brood and dryly told a reporter, well, here we are, just an average American family. In order to establish the required residency in New York State, the multimillionaire candidate leased a 25-room mansion, Marymead, in the chic Glen Cove on Long Island. They also had an elegant suite with 3 bedrooms at the Carlyle Hotel in Manhattan. Nevertheless, RFK was termed a carpetbagger by some of the media and by his political opponents, since he still retained Hickory Hill and was registered to vote in Massachusetts, not in New York, where before he had announced his candidacy, he had very little political or personal connections. After a rigorous 9-week campaign, RFK won the election, beating the Republican incumbent 64-year-old Kenneth B. Keating. And 6 days after RFK was sworn in, Ethel gave birth on January 10, 1965, to her 6th son, number 9 in the Team Kennedy lineup, who was named Matthew Maxwell Taylor Kennedy, in honor of the U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam, a close friend of the family. Because Hickory Hill was overrun with Ethel's brood and Bobby's menagerie of animals, something had to be done to bring about some peace and quiet. 11-year-old Bobby, already becoming something of a behavior problem to his mother, who now had 9 rambunctious children, 6 boys, 3 girls, and counting, was sent away, along with his brother Joe, to the exclusive Georgetown Prep School in Bethesda, a half hour or so from home. There, at the oldest all-boys Jesuit private school in the United States, he began boarding in September 1965 as a 7th grader. If he had stayed there and succeeded academically, he would have been in the Georgetown Prep class of 1971. But it didn't turn out that way. For most of Bobby Kennedy Jr.'s adult life, he was said by those who knew him intimately to have had an inferiority complex in regard to the level of his intelligence. He never thought he was very smart, according to those close observers. He never believed that he had, for instance, the brain power of his father, or of his Uncle Jack, or even his Uncle Ted. He had always considered himself something of a dimwit, which was far from the reality, but that's what he believed. So, in his late 50s, around 2011, he decided to have his intelligence evaluated by voluntarily submitting to take an IQ test. Subsequently, he confided to a longtime friend, the journalist Peter Kaplan, that his score had shocked him. It was, he boasted, off the charts, placing him, he claimed, in the brilliant range, although he was said to have kept the actual score to himself. Despite his claimed high IQ, however, Bobby was never much of a student, and academics were usually never a high priority, which was the case, too, with his forebears Jack, Ted, and RFK. And certainly it was never high on the achievements of his mother's family, the Skakels. There were no outstanding students on either side. Still, Bobby stood out for his feats of daring and what his classmates considered his exotic and offbeat hobby. The 7th graders, about 20 in all, held their classes in one of the chapel's stuffy basement storerooms that had been converted into a makeshift classroom. The back wall of the chapel itself was made of brick, and that's where Bobby showed off his Kennedy steel. He would climb straight up the wall, like 10 feet, and we would just be standing there watching him in awe, a classmate said. He was always real skinny and lanky, and he could get a really good grip on the bricks, and he had absolutely no fear. He climbed up that wall like he was Spider-Man. Every so often, Bobby brought his pet falcon to school for a show and tell. Some of his classmates were impressed. Others thought he was a weirdo because he loved birds and had a menagerie of them at Hickory Hill. Bobby's daring, demonstrated when he climbed up the brick wall in 7th grade, had almost resulted in another fatal Kennedy tragedy during the summer vacation of 1966 when he was between 7th and 8th grade. Hanging out at the Kennedy compound, he jumped off the roof of one of the family's garages, crashed through a window, and was almost killed. He had severed a tendon and required 100 stitches to close the critical lacerations on his leg. Bobby's daredevil and reckless antics, however, would continue for years, and curiously, he sometimes used his various scars, accompanied by dramatic accounts of how he suffered them, as part of his seduction technique with sympathetic young women. But that was still to come. He wasn't chasing girls, nor were girls chasing him, yet. And that concludes this episode. We got through the prologue and chapter 1 of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and the Dark Side of the Dream by Jerry Oppenheimer. And in the next episode, we will talk about the assassination of his father in 1968 and the impact that that had on a young RFK Jr. It's an episode you certainly won't want to miss. Till then, take care. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for listening.